there is a period of time that you're going to experience afterwards that feels kind of like recovering from a funeral. This is a video I'm really nervous about making, and I'm nervous about making it for a handful of reasons. One, it's a big topic and it deserves a great deal of respect, and I think that it may deserve more respect than I'm able to give it. The second reason that I'm nervous about it is because it has a very large audience, and there are some particularly strong feelings about the work itself that are generally positive and insofar as its influence on science fiction and insofar as its existence as a science fiction work. I'm also very nervous because it's a work of science fiction that has been approved by the CCP, which is the governing body of China. There have been some really fantastic essays and videos and video essays that have been dedicated to this work that I'm going to talk about today. And they have by and large been done really well. And insofar as recounting the plots of these novels, there are other videos out there that do a much better job than this video will do. My focus is somewhere else. There's a whole lot of ground to cover, and I don't want to spend too much time on caveats, but I need you to understand where I'm coming from before I begin. And, I sat down in sort of my academic literary mode, and I did something that I don't usually do before I record a book review, and that's I wrote an essay. I wrote everything down, or generally everything down that I wanted to say and wanted to cover and make sure that I had properly articulated or thought out, and I considered just reading it, and it's not what this channel is. This channel isn't me reading an essay to you. This channel is me delivering on the guttural level, giving you my straightforward take as it comes to me from my soul. But like I said, I think that this series deserves a little bit more than that. So I've done a little bit of extra work. There will likely be a little bit of extra editing in this video, simply because there is so much to cover, and I would like to be as precise about this as I can, though just knowing me personally, I probably won't be as precise as necessary. So with that, I want to move on to a little bit, one more caveat that's a little bit more serious. So this commentary is my personal interpretation, and at no point should you get the notion that I am an expert on China, that I'm an expert on Chinese history, on Chinese politic, or on the Chinese people. I would also like to be very clear about this, that anything negative that I say in this review, and there are negative things that I say in this review, anything negative that I say in this review is not directed at the Chinese people. The Chinese people are an amazing people. And unfortunately, they have been stuck under the thumb of an authoritarian government for nearly a century. And we could argue that for the last 3,000 years, the Chinese people have been stuck under the thumbs of authoritarian governments. So, to be very clear, when I speak negatively about the Chinese ruling authority, in this video, these comments are not directed at the Chinese people. I'd also like to say directly to authoritarians themselves, be they the authoritarian rulers of a nation of people, or be they wannabe authoritarian billionaires, millionaires, the people who are essentially vampirical in nature. I want to say to you that we will not reach the distant lands of the future with authoritarians in our midst. That's either a warning to us that we as a people are doomed, or it's a warning to authoritarians that authoritarians are doomed. Liu Cixin, or Cixin Liu, is a contemporary Chinese science fiction or speculative fiction author. Although I personally don't recognize the label speculative fiction just because I'm a weirdo. Liu Cixin was born in the early 1960s, I think in 1963. And as a child, he was sent to live with his grandparents in Henan province, I believe. I apologize. I'm going to get some of these details wrong, so just bear with me. But the critical point is that he was present for the Benhua Dam failure in 1975. And this was a dam failure that triggered the failure of, I believe it was 61 other dams in the region. There's an estimated death toll, of approximately 240,000 individuals, but the actual number is really unknown, and it's likely that either the data wasn't properly collected at the time, or the data was properly collected and then the truth was sort of washed over. One of the recurring themes with this discussion and its relevance to Chinese history and the Chinese ruling authority is that we have to ignore the body count. Now, Liu Cixin went on to become an engineer, and he worked hard as an engineer for many years. And, at some point, he transitioned from being a full-time engineer to writing full-time. And his work has been extremely lauded in China and has been widely accepted by the Chinese ruling authority. And so much so that it's actually taught in elementary schools. As it is now, I'm not certain. There may be. I would love for somebody to tell me one way or the other, but I don't believe that there's a single American university right now that has a course dedicated to this series, which you could absolutely do. You could dedicate an entire college course to just talking about this set of books here. When you read the book, one of the first questions that you have to ask yourself is, why did the CCP greenlight this? And I want to be really clear and say this directly now. I want to give my dearest and most sincere thanks to the Chinese censors who allowed Liu Cixin to write these works and allowed these works to see the outside world. Because beyond being products of China and the Chinese ruling authority, they're products of humanity. And when the ruling authority of China determines that some kind of art or literature or entertainment is unacceptable for view of the masses, then what they're doing is they're ignoring their own humanity and limiting the humanity of another individual. So thank you for not murdering Liu Cixin or sending him to a re-education camp the moment that you got the first draft of these books. It's shocking to me as a Westerner reading these works, because whether or not the ruling parties that be in China recognized it, there's something deeply critical about authoritarianism in these books. And I've yet to see anyone online really dive into that. and really give it the full accounting that it deserves. So that's going to be my attempt here. So there's a new term in contemporary Western popular culture, and that term is black pill. And typically the term is associated with the incel community, the involuntary celibate community, the white supremacist community, and their tendency to take ideas to the furthest extreme. And so you hear the term red pill or blue pill, or then you follow that up with black pill. I'm sure there are other ones as well that I'm unfamiliar with. But the term black pill essentially, it's representative of a total devaluation of your self-worth as a human. And I think that puts it a little mildly, a little simply, but it's essentially the intentional self-deconstruction of your personal being and any bits of personal love that you may have for yourself, and by extension for anyone else. It's simply, in a lot of ways, it's a license to be a nihilistic asshole. But in terms of science fiction, and especially in terms of these books, I have stolen the phrase because of the nature of many of the deep cosmic ideas that are presented in these books, and the way that those ideas make you feel, the way that those ideas leave you, and the way that they force you personally to reshape your perceived cosmology, it can be very destructive the first time you encounter them, especially if you hold the full weight of the ideas in your mind. And so I have personally dubbed those things cosmic black pills. And they are truths, perceived truths about the universe that we can choose to accept or not to accept. Some specific to our cosmos in general, and some specific to the books and the plot within the books. In either case, were you to imagine these scenarios in real life, you would be forced to go through that deep cosmological reckoning, that that moment where you lay awake at 3 a.m. and you are gripped with terror at the knowledge of your own mortality and whatever the ultimate truth of the universe may or may not be. We give ourselves cosmic black pills all the time in various ways, and we have throughout history, and some of them were warranted. Nuclear weapons are bad. You know, even the invention of nuclear weapons is a cosmic black pill for humanity. We had to swallow it and understand that not only are we capable of creating weapons like this, but we're going to use them. So Liu Cixin forces us throughout this series of books to swallow very chunky cosmic black pills. They're ideas that make us question our entire cosmology and our comfort zone within it. The majority of my conversation is going to focus on those cosmic black pills and explain, in my interpretation, the influence of an authoritarian government on them. If there's one thing the CCP and the innocent citizens of China know, it's misinformation campaigns. In our reality, the CCP murdered an untold number of people across the 20th century, of their own people. But their murders typically weren't just followed by the relief of having removed a subversive voice from the chorus. Instead, the Chinese would go a step further and publicly discredit the individuals, sometimes just before their execution. This was to preserve the overall narratives proposed by the CCP. So any personal philosophy or information not clearly in sync with the insecurities of the Chinese authority were eliminated so that they could maintain supremacy over messaging. And it seems that Lu Shishin's portrayal of the Trisolarans is consistent with this known way of life for Lu. The Trisolarans, centuries before their arrival, attempt to sway the security of Earth by introducing skepticism into known science. So they introduce mysticism as a destabilizing force, and they attempt to create a loyal faction amongst the humans. And all of this looks and feels like historical Maoist anti-superstition campaigns. So these are simultaneously the kinds of actions the CCP both despises in other nations, but has readily employed on its own population. And so again, if basic truths are called into question, what can a human really be sure of? If we can't rely on cosmological constants or verify science with experiment and data, then truth is an abstraction we must rely on an authority to provide. Take this quote from the three-body problem. Quote, "The mental states of the Trisolarans needed were calmness and numbness. The history of the past 200-some cycles of civilization proved that civilizations that relied on these two states as their spiritual core were the most capable of survival." And the Trisolarans themselves existed in a star system with 3 stars that was inherently chaotic. There were long periods of absolute devastation of the Trisolaran civilizations over and over and over and over again. Chaos era after chaos era after chaos era, with billions of Trisolarans dying at a time. And yet, each time the cycle restarts itself, you enter an age of prosperity where the Trisolarans, they try their best, not to think about the body count, of course. And they act upon their citizenry this need for calmness and numbness to ride out these eras of chaos and prosperity. And the parallels with Chinese civilization simply cannot be ignored. In terms of Western science fiction, the situation presented by the Trisolarans, the introduction of the Sophon, etc., would have been met with intense opposition. The Westerner would rail against this trap and immediately begin looking for solutions they could farm from any mind available. But Lu presents us with a reaction that is almost acquiescence or a general acceptance of fate. This inevitably leads to the Great Rift, wherein 5 billion humans are lost to the results of authoritarian billionaires leaning into the apparent unavoidable outcomes of an alien attack from beyond. So all of the terrestrial problems are then exacerbated in these books, with famine and chaos claiming victory over humans. But, of course, given enough time and the appropriate loss of life, the CCP eventually produces prosperity once again for the survivors, and hope that with fewer mouths to feed and increases in technological innovation, despite the existence of the Sophon, or alien opposition in general, all is well that ends well. Just don't think about the body count. So to the CCP, idealism decays only because of factionalism. And this is in many ways, the root of the inherent weakness of the CCP. And that's to say that if the CCP, can't stand the opposition of factional thought, or they can't stand oppositional thought in general, and they have to stamp it out as, reactionary or subversive thought, in much the same way that Scientology does. That necessarily projects weakness and insecurity. And if we're going to get really to the root of what makes an authoritarian, it's insecurity. We've all seen that recently here in the West. So you've got this completely insecure authoritarian government in China, and they love to boast that there are bridges in China that are older than the United States. And that's cool. But the reality is that most of the bridges built after the Republican Revolution, they don't tend to last more than one presidential term. And those are literal bridges and figurative bridges. And this is a credit to the CCP's obsession with this notion that eras of chaos lead to eras of prosperity. But all you got to do is ignore the body count. So over the past 100 years, humans have leaned heavily on this notion that scientific discovery and scientific progress and technological discovery and technological progress will inevitably lead to human prosperity. So with this in mind, it's really interesting that Liu chose to use this particular cosmic black pill to cripple humanity. Somewhere beyond what was known was now an arbitrary line drawn by an authoritarian government, the Trisolarians, which clearly stated, beyond this point, you shall learn nothing which could lead to your cosmic freedom. And if that's not a direct criticism of the CCP within these books, I just don't know what is. We see this tendency, especially today under CCP authority. They simultaneously wish for their youth to become highly educated in the sciences, to bring about innovation and technological dominance, while also hamstringing their youth's ability to access information or think in ways that may be considered by the insecure authority to be subversive, or even to self-regulate or question their own social or political reality. It's like setting someone on fire and then demanding that they shit out ice cubes. It's untenable, and it's exactly why the Sophon itself is nightmarish. To imprison a global species' ability to learn while instigating the same state of cultural numbness the Trisolarians themselves suffer from seems to be an obvious attempt by Cixin Liu to turn the mirror on the CCP. But fortunately or unfortunately, the CCP isn't substantive enough to have a reflection, much less see themselves in it. So when an individual is inherently weak and they're relying on others for the positive outcome of their fate, then the insecure position is likely to be, don't leave me. And this is exactly the reaction that the CCP demonstrates in the three-body problem and in the rest of the series. When faced with the incontrovertible reality that a more advanced species is coming to obliterate human civilization and steal the planet from the humans, the insecure position of the ruling authority of humans in this scenario is to do exactly that, to say, don't leave me, to outlaw escapism, and to say, Once again, we're either prosperous together or we suffer together. We see this idea, especially today, as the CCP props up illegal police stations in foreign countries. Their message to their people is clear. You can never escape, and escape will not be tolerated. It's an odd position for a small group of ruling billionaires to make. For it isn't with the unifying brotherhood of the worker that the CCP uses to bind its people together. Rather, it's the blind adherence to the laws of the wealthy authority. When the Cultural Revolution took place, it was couched in the notion of setting the worker or the working class free from the clutches of the wealthy authoritarians. But just like Russia, the CCP perverted this action into just a simple transfer of wealth and power from one small group to another small group. And this makes the entire notion of the presence of communist governments in the 20th century just an outright joke. At least now, the CCP has mostly stopped pretending that they serve the people and outwardly regard themselves as an authoritarian kleptocracy that they've always been. Human rights and equality have deep roots. Inequality of survival is the worst sort of inequality, and the people and countries left behind will never just sit and wait for death while others have a way out. There will be increasingly extreme confrontations between the two sides until there's world chaos and then no one goes. This kleptomania doesn't escape the ruling class within Cixin Liu's books. In an attempt of true vanity to appeal to the fate of the masses, the CCP within the Dark Forest bans the very notion of escaping Earth. They censor 20th century books and entertainment, lest the people's minds be filled with notions of bravado or preservation or the pursuit of cosmic freedom. In the CCP and Liu's world wants everyone to go down with the ship together, and they express this using a perverted version of, quote, inequality. It's old hat for the CCP to speak of the evils of inequality while absolutely enforcing the preservation of a uniquely unequal society. It's the kind of doublespeak that authoritarians are great at. We see this in red states within the US, as individuals are lulled into voting against their own best interests in the hopes that they can poke someone else in the eye, while ultimately just blinding themselves. It's the way in which authoritarians of all flavors gain the compliance of a population. They use the inherent paranoia of a population against themselves. The parallels with the actual CCP just can't be ignored. And they really just serve to flavor Cixin Liu's horror with these dashes of truth and reminders of our actual reality. Western science fiction is not without horror. One could argue that the horror found in Western science fiction, by and large, is generally a leftist critique of a capitalist system. And you could look at Alien. Alien's a perfect example of this. There's many other examples, both in film and literature. By and large, the majority of Western science fiction depicts a cosmos that is either completely empty, which leaves humans to discover themselves and look inward, or it's a fairly even balance of optimism, terror, adventure, discovery, wonder, with a little bit of pessimism and cynicism sort of sprinkled in there, of course. But it's typically, it's discovery in equal parts. But Cixin Liu presents us with the darkest version of cosmic reality, the notion of the dark forest. Essentially, this means that the reason we do not detect a galaxy full of life, it's because life of a certain age understands that it must hide itself in order to survive. that the cosmos is filled with hunters that would effortlessly snuff out a species rather than later compete with it for the limited resources throughout the cosmos. It's absolutely unsurprising to me that an authoritarian society, with its grip on the flow of information, would produce such a bleak interpretation of the cosmos. It points directly at the insecurity of the society the CCP has built. Paranoia instigates a desire to bury one's head, stay out of the attentions of authority, or take comfort in the simple pleasures of poverty and obscurity, because that makes it less likely for you to be a target. Furthermore, we see the bleak, unempathetic nature of the CCP's billionaire rulers on display as Cixin Liu considers the inevitability of the existence of an equally uncaring cosmos full of equally uncaring civilizations. Civilizations that would casually destroy all of the unique beauty of a world, lest it become a threat later. We see this in every acre of land that China declares as its own, from every river and valley that it dams and fills. We see it in every league of sea that China attempts to inflict its authority on, or on every sovereign nation or territory that possesses something that the CCP ultimately covets. If they could entrap an entire population in the second spatial dimension, the CCP would unhesitatingly oblige just to preserve its dominance. So ultimately, the dark forest theory is the most horrific form of projection I've ever seen in a widely accepted cosmological construct. And it's now a popular, widely accepted theory, with good reason. But I can't help but recognize that it's a theory that comes at the very peak of human cynicism. It's a theory that comes at the very peak of human denialism, of their own personal authority over the planet that we have here and our own personal responsibilities to the planet that we have here. It may be one of the darkest cosmic black pills in the entire series, because it does fundamentally reshape the way that we look at the cosmos. And it fundamentally reshapes the feelings of wonder and optimism that most of us feel when we look up at the sky, when we look at the moon and we look at the stars and we think, what's out there? What mysteries can we solve? Humans love to solve mysteries. We are curious. And that's one of the things that really makes us uniquely human. But when you paint the entire sky black and say, here there be dragons, then it puts us into a position where, we revert back to the simple apes who were afraid of the dark, who hid in the cave and wished for warmth and wished for light in the darkness. It really is one of the most horrific things in the book. Where does actual power come from? If we listen to authoritarians, then we have to assume that actual power comes from a strong arm. It comes from doing what I say or else. It comes from extreme laws. It comes from censorship. It comes from limiting individuals and attempting to dissolve the individual nature of citizens within a society and turn them into a collective. It's much easier to ignore the body count if you don't have to think about individuals. It's clear that as this lowly planet-bound species, there's a huge subsect of us that don't understand what real power is. And this interpretation, the strong arm interpretation of authoritarian power, of being a target in the dark forest, of just the basic perverse nature of this idea, is something that I feel is truly inherent to authoritarian science fiction. Westerners love to freak each other out, and we love to find the next big thing to gross out our buddies with, and we do that in entertainment across the board. But there's always a tongue in the cheek there. But Cixin Liu is serious about this. And he's serious about his dialogue on power and where it comes from and how inescapable authoritarian control, even in the greater cosmos, actually is. So what is the ultimate conclusion to the quest for ultimate power? It's the control of the atom, of course. And if the 20th century taught us anything, it taught us that those with even the slightest control of the atom had absolute dominance. Cixin Liu's world is no different. When faced with technology that can perfectly control the conversion of matter into energy, the planet is helpless and appears to immediately succumb to the dominating force. And ironically, it's really a Western component in this work that makes the difference. It's when a single human threatens to cry out into the cosmic night and announce humanity's presence to an even greater authoritarian power in the cosmos. Than the apparent dominant force that was attacking Earth. And maybe it's just my own Western experience, but I can't help but place the character Luoji's decision in the context of a handful of Chinese outliers who thumb their noses at the authority and speak truth to power. Under our current human paradigm of dominance, authoritarians exist only as far as their lies travel, and truth is the ultimate salve. In Cixin Liu's world, leaning into the truth of the dark forest and appealing to an even larger dominant force for protection, even if that ultimately spells the same flavor of doom, it really demonstrates the level of oppression that the people of China exist beneath. Even the threat of appealing to a larger force is enough to either limit the authoritarian control or to get an individual erased from existence. And either outcome is preferable than existing under the thumb of total authoritarian dominance. An authoritarian's control is really only limited by the realities of our mortal human bodies. It would likely be, just the absolute wet dream of every previous Chinese ruler to go to sleep during eras of chaos and only awake to rule during eras of prosperity. The Chinese love to remind the world, with good reason, that their contiguous civilization is 3,000 years old. And there's a lot to argue about there. But I think it is very clear that what the Chinese people have done for the last 3,000 years is trade one authoritarian regime for another, consistently. So if you're an authoritarian and you discover a way to leap off into the future and escape the inevitabilities of the physical human body and continue to extend your power across great stretches of time, then you would label that as an acceptable form of escape. It's not really escapism that the authority has banned. No one can leave. But if you're in a position of authority and you want to dash off to the future, well, that's just fine. We're going to need that continuity of authoritarian power in order to beat this authoritarian foe that's coming for us. At least that's the logic that Cixin Liu presents to us. So, of course, throughout the trilogy, Cryonics is used as a way to follow characters we're invested in throughout the deep stretches of time that are employed by the novels. And we focus only on them and their growth and revelations through the passage of centuries and, the ever-present constancy of the CCP. And even though the focus is on the characters, we can't ignore the implication that the CCP employs cryonics to maintain authoritarian consistency through the novels. Gone are the days when we can wait for a despot to die mid-coitus with a concubine or be stabbed in the back by his political rivals. Enter the reality of scientific and medical intervention to keep despots alive and kicking across vast stretches of time. We also see this with the Trisolarans. The Trisolarans have the ability in times of chaos to desiccate themselves, to release all moisture from their body. And it isn't until moisture is reintroduced to their body that they're able to resurrect themselves. So there's a direct correlation between these two ideas of using cryonics to escape into the future and using cryonics to keep despots alive across the centuries. And the horror is obvious. And the reality of this horror is closer than we'd like to imagine in our current paradigm here. While billionaires and authoritarians are most certainly a cancer, they have an expiration date as well as we all do. And if you change that, then you have the construction of an infinite social nightmare, the likes of which humanity has never faced. But oddly, the cryogenics aspect of the novels are nearly the most optimistic feature in the series. There's this deep feeling of relief knowing that the characters escaped the initial human cataclysms by dashing off in a dream world towards the future. There's hope, maybe the only hope in these novels, but there's hope in the notion of escaping into the future. But that hope is shadowed for almost any reader by the realization that the same old authoritarian bastards are still present and not at risk of disappearing anytime soon, despite the change brought about by impending alien destruction and a race to the end of what could be achieved technologically before that destruction occurs. So there are many reasons why authoritarians gain control. But I think that primarily through their sociopathy, they recognize some fundamental truths about humans. There are truths like people need to eat, and need breeds control, and all men live and all men die. They're basic fundamental truths to our species. And in a lot of ways, they define what it is that we can know about the world. Or at least they define how we interact with the world. We have to satisfy our basic needs, and we have to give up some of our own personal control to someone else in order for those needs to be met. And we act in a way that is self-preserving and preserves our own personal existence. And authoritarians know that we're going to do those things, that we're going to act in those ways, because those are fundamentally human ways to act. And we've been given just enough senses that we believe that we can fully define our reality. That, we have an entire suite of sensory applications available to our brains, and we use those senses in order to model the world that we interact with. And fundamentally and individually, we tend to feel like we have a grasp on that reality. And that very fundamental basic reality is essential to authoritarian control. The rub is any time that humanity pushes past those known knowns and those accepted truths, not only about ourselves, but about the physical reality that we interact with. And when we do that, when we push past those known knowns and we push past our fundamental understanding of our universe and our reality, that makes the authority at large very squeamish. Take, for example, the explosion in psychedelic use in the mid-20th century, opening our minds to the possibilities larger than those fundamental truths that we're accustomed to. It makes authority uneasy. There are knee-jerk reactions that follow, the clamping down on freedoms, hoping to maintain the fundamental understanding that our reality, lest we fall to confusion and dismay, we may stop following authority entirely. And Cixin Liu takes this threat as far as possible. And he suggests that the original state of the universe was a perfect 10 spatial dimensions. And through the actions of civilizations within the dark forest, those perfect 10 dimensions have given way slowly to the ravages of superweapons. And each of these weapons, they attack in a specific way, breaking down the universe into smaller and smaller spatial dimensions. So if the universe itself is undergoing this unstoppable change, and our reality evolved in the much, much lower third dimension, then truly we know nothing of super reality. We may as well already be sketches on a sheet of paper. And, in cases like that, authority loses all meaning when faced with this kind of breakdown in reality. And that's the very last thing that any authority wants to happen. So with our tiny meat brains, it's nearly impossible to consider what even a fourth spatial dimension would look like or feel like. But in his brilliance, Cixin Liu fills in the details of this nightmare for us. Before reading this excerpt, I want to just go off on a complete tangent for just a second and just sort of take a break from our talk about authoritarianism, because it's a tough subject. And I want to talk about UFOs for just a second. And of course, there's been lots of interesting news recently about whistleblowers and the nature of non-human intelligence, and whether or not we have magical technologies hidden away in bunkers somewhere and all that jazz. And there's something that, there's a theory that I've leaned into for many, many years now, is that when you see a UFO or a phenomenal craft of, whatever shape, or a tic-tac, a sphere, a flying saucer, whatever it is, what you're actually seeing is the three-dimensional shadow cast by a four-dimensional object. And it could even still be true with craft recovered and in a bunker somewhere that no one can figure out. You might still only be looking at the three-dimensional shadow of a four-dimensional object. And the whole concept of the fourth spatial dimension is very hard to wrap your mind around. And I'll throw a link down below to a really great visualization that can help. But Cixin Liu did an absolutely phenomenal job explaining the fourth spatial dimension to readers. And it's especially interesting now with this latest whistleblower. He's very slightly making the claim that whatever this phenomenon is, it could exist from another dimension. And a lot of people, when they hear, interdimensional craft, man, they think in a very Rick and Morty sort of way that, you're traveling from this one very clear, three-dimensional space that's like yours but just drastically different, and into another three-dimensional space that's like yours but just drastically different. Or some people are confused with the notion of the fourth dimension and say, well, time is the fourth dimension. And there's lots of thought to be had about temporal dimensionality. But when we're talking about spatial dimensions, we're talking about physical spatial dimensions. And we're not talking about a temporal dimension. We're not talking about multiple universes. We're talking about a spatial dimension that exists in the same space as another spatial dimension, but simply cannot be sensed by creatures that are trapped in lower spatial dimensions. So when we draw a stick figure on a piece of paper, that stick figure, even if you explain to him the concept of the third dimension, he just is not going to be able to wrap his mind around it because he's inherently a two-dimensional being. But Lou does it. Lou successfully translates the fourth spatial dimension into understandable language that I think successfully gets the point across. From Cixin Liu. A person looking back upon the three-dimensional world from four-dimensional space for the first time realized this right away. He had never seen the world while he was in it. If the three-dimensional world were likened to a picture, all he had seen before was just a narrow view from the side, a line. Only from four-dimensional space could he see the picture as a whole. He would describe it this way. Nothing blocked whatever was placed behind it. Even the interiors of sealed spaces were laid open. This seemed a simple change. But when the world was displayed this way, the visual effect was utterly stunning, with all barriers and concealments stripped away, and everything exposed. The amount of information entering the viewer's eyes was hundreds of millions of times greater than when he was in three-dimensional space. The brain could not even process so much information right away. In Morovich and Guan's eyes, blue space was a magnificent, immense painting that had just been unrolled. They could see all the way to the stern and all the way to the bow. They could see inside every cabin and every sealed container in the ship. They could see the liquid flowing through the mazes of tubes and the fiery ball of fusion in the reactor at the stern. Of course, the rules of perspective remained in operation, and objects far away appeared indistinct. But everything was visible. Even given this description, those who had never experienced four-dimensional space might get the wrong impression that they were seeing everything through the hull. But no, they were not seeing through anything. Everything was laid out in the open, just like when we look at a circle drawn on a piece of paper. We can see inside the circle without looking through anything. This kind of openness extended to every level, and the hardest part was describing how it applied to solid objects. One could see the interior of solids just as the bulkhead or the piece of metal or a rock. One could see all the cross-sections at once. Morovich and Guan were drowning in a sea of information. All the details of the universe were gathered around them. This isn't just a cosmic black pill for humanity. It's a cosmic black pill for human authoritarians generally. What great irony that the authoritarian's main tool is the lie, when reality itself is an even greater lie. one impenetrable to the simple authoritarian mind or the basic senses of a human. And to be intentionally meta, when Cixin Liu, we see Cixin Liu once again project this bleak authoritarian mindset onto the higher dimensional beings as well. For they share not only the lust for supreme authority at all costs, but they also share that total lack of empathy for the myriad lower creatures who are simply living their lives. They're smelling flowers, making love, painting pictures, making music. These are all dalliances that are unacceptable to the insecure, be they the cosmic insecure or the planet bound. In opposition to authoritarians, humans that are under the power of authoritarians, they often, at least internally, if not externally, the ones that push back, they feel it in their soul. They say, that's a lie. That's a lie. And the authoritarian just goes, And they cast doubt, and they gaslight, and they make you think that you're insane. And again, we come back to the inherent insecurity of the authoritarian mindset. And if you really were to sit an authoritarian down and say, look at this truth, look at this real super reality, it would break their minds. Because the authoritarian mind is a simple mind. It's more simple than the carpenter or the farmer or the laborer. It's a toddler's mind. It's a mind that says, give it to me now or I'll throw a hissy fit. That's why the cure for authoritarianism generally, at least in some part, is the use of psychedelics. I've been known many times to make the suggestion that if you want to be the leader of a country, there should be one final bar after being elected to office by the people. You should have one final test. And that's 8 grams of mushrooms in a dark room. Imagine this guy. We don't give toddlers psychedelics for good reasons. And that's Can you imagine this guy? Can you imagine him just completely losing his fucking mind on mushrooms? You want to talk about realizing how absolutely insignificant and weak you are. But then again, sociopaths don't react to psychedelics the way that normal, empathetic humans do. So in one final knife's jab at what we all perceive as reality, Cixin Liu takes aim finally at more and deeper fundamental truths of the science that defines our cosmology. And he essentially takes away the cosmological constant. Our understanding of the physical cosmos and its lifespan is primarily based on things that we can recognize collectively as physical constants. Matter is the same as energy. The speed of light is not variable. Newtonian physics works just fine in non-quantum situations. But if you eliminate any of those perceived physical truths, our entire cosmology collapses. And Cixin Liu doesn't shy away from this. In an almost postmodern approach, Cixin Liu systematically deconstructs cosmological truths that keep us sane. It's as if the only way to escape the authoritarian construct that he exists within is to pull at the very threads of the universe that shape our truth, our cosmological reality. In a way, it's the ultimate fuck you to the CCP. He's saying to them, you believe you control truth, but there are perceived truths far greater than yours. And they are actually lies that cast such a shadow, you, the authoritarian, will be in darkness forever. It's almost as if Lu is fighting the very notion of truth altogether, as if he's suggesting that since we cannot exist in a society that's based on truth and openness and understanding, then no one can live in a cosmos based on truth. Not the West, not the East, not the free nations, not the authoritarian nations. He has stolen the cosmological constant as a fundamental truth of our reality. He's taken it from us. And then he wants us to deal with it. And ultimately, Cixin Liu is a prisoner of the CCP, just as humans are prisoners to the cosmos. He is alone, under the thumb of a totally uncaring behemoth, and any objection he may have has to be thoroughly embedded in a form of literature that's too impenetrable for the soulless, sociopathic buffoons who determine his fate to notice. It's like a Mississippian saying, bless your heart. No matter how many layers of politeness it's wrapped in, it's still a fuck you. So there's a fairly colorful history of Chinese science fiction and speculative fiction. Sorry, I had to do that. There's a very colorful history of Chinese science fiction and Chinese speculative fiction. And what's funny, and I'm woefully underinformed as to the nature of all of it. But as I understand it, there was a period following the Republican Revolution where speculative fiction writers were gotten rid of, and they were either washed or they were murdered, or both. And the ruling authority at the time did not see the value in speculating about the future, and especially speculating about Chinese future. And mainly because of, like I said, authoritarians are very short-sighted. They're not very smart people. So they didn't see the value in it. But then in the 50s with Sputnik and the American and Russian race to the moon, there were Chinese science fiction writers who came to the surface to really lay out the potential greatness of the People's Republic, and to lay out the potential successes that they could have in science and technology, and piercing the boundary of our planet-bound civilization. And thankfully, someone within the party was smart enough to see the value in this, and they allowed it to exist. And in so many ways, I feel like Cixin Liu's work is in the same vein. He's not outwardly admonishing authoritarian control. And from the authoritarian's perspective, he could be very clearly laying out an argument to say, here is why we should maintain authoritarian control. The universe is a dark forest. No one can really know the truth of our reality. We need someone to guide us, to lead us, to take us, to tell us what to do, to tell us lowly, simple humans what to do. And that is sort of the message that comes through. And like I said, it's probably the thing that saved Liu's skin. Because the CCP can point to this book and say, see, even though it all ended in tragedy, as all things do, it was but for the guiding light of the Eastern authority, of the authoritarian control over human civilization, that ultimately spared us for some amount of time before the inevitable occurred. Just don't count the body. Since 1989, there's been a new wave of Chinese science fiction authors, and again, I'm woefully underinformed about them. But Cixin Liu was the first one of these that I had any experience with. And in first reading A Remembrance of Earth's Past, I was profoundly struck with the difference in cultural lens. For anyone who has any experience with Western science fiction, literary or film, the Western perspective should be more than evident, even down to the perpetual regurgitation of the tired Campbellian hero's journey. There are few examples of Western science fiction that truly diverge from our Western cultural perspective. A people who are generally granted freedom to think, freedom to imagine, freedom to write, freedom to speak. They tend to generate a particular kind of generally optimistic perspectives that I simply couldn't find in Cixin Liu's work. Even so-called postmodern science fiction that takes the grimmest interpretations out to play in the cosmos, it does little to rival the bleakness of science fiction written under authoritarian control. I'm very interested to read more of the Chinese science fiction genre in the hopes of establishing whether or not this bleak pessimism is inherent in the genre as a whole. My guess is that it most definitely is. I want to add one other thing to the initial caveats that I gave at the beginning, and this might come at the end of the video. I think it's important for people who are interested in these books to either understand something or get permission for something. I'm going to give you permission for something here. There are a lot of people out there that have very strong feelings about audiobooks, and it's unclear why. I listen to a couple of audiobooks a year, typically on long drives, or sometimes when I'm at the gym, I'll pop on an audiobook and listen. And it's a different experience than reading, but it's not. I don't think it's something to be criticized. And I think that this series, if you're going to choose a book to consume in an audio format, this series is a great series to do that. This was actually 2 years ago now. She, for whatever reason, started listening to the first book in the series. Maybe I had recommended it to her. I'm not sure. And she's like, man, you got to do this. You got to do this. And so we ended up having an insane drive in front of us. We were going somewhere for a holiday, and we were looking at like a 22-hour drive. And I'm a music in the car kind of guy usually, but she's like, we're doing the three-body problem. So I said, cool. And she throws it on, and that is the drive. And what was interesting is of Kansas and Nebraska throughout the first part of the three-body problem during the Cultural Revolution portions that are very grim. And so looking at the landscape of laborers and thinking about the rural parts of China that exist in the first book, there was something remarkably consistent about my visual experience and my auditory experience at the time. So we ended up doing the first book on the way to where we were going, and I think we knocked out the second book on the way home, or at least 98% of it. And then the third book, I sort of did a combination of reading and listening. And by that time, the names and the proper nouns were much easier for me to wrap my head around. But it really is one of those series that lends itself really well to audio. And if you don't have a lot of time and you're not ready to put out the effort that is required to get through these books, you should feel completely free to audiobook these books. These are perfect books for the audiobook format. And especially the first one, the recording on Audible of the first one has some incredible voice actors, especially for the character Dasha. And it is completely worth it. It's really fantastic. It is an incredibly fun way to consume these books. And I give you permission to audiobook them because there's absolutely no sin in that. And I think that the more people who are able to consume these books and think about the concepts within, the more interesting the conversation around them is going to get. And I should warn anyone, when you finish these books, there is a period of time that you're going to experience afterwards that feels kind of like recovering from a funeral. And for me, it was burying some of those cosmological truths that I had held close to my heart that kept me sane about the cosmos, and replacing those things that I thought were absolutes with something fundamentally darker and fundamentally more confusing. It can do a number on you, and it can leave you in a dark place. So be careful with these books. These are not happy books. And there's a real noticeable effect that they can have on an individual. I really appreciate you spending so much time with me. I've been very nervous about making this video. If I happen to die suddenly or disappear into a Chinese prison, it's probably clear why. So, thank you. And thank you, Shishin Lu. Thank you, Lu Shishin. And once again, thanks to the Authoritarian CCP censors for allowing this work to exist. However it happened, you made the right decision this time. So good for you.